All right.
Hi, this is Paul, and I have my friend Ron with me. He was with us on Friday on the Friday live stream. And I've known Ron for a number of years, and this is kind of an unusual situation where I'm going to rando somebody that I actually know fairly well, but I'm sure I will learn a lot of new things because actually a lot of the things that I cover in a pretty typical randos conversation aren't usually the things I sort of cover with colleagues. And so this is going to be sort of a new experience for me too, and we'll see how it goes. So, Ron, thank you for agreeing to this.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
All right. Well, Ron, this is the question I usually open with. I change it up sometimes, but I'll keep it for you. Tell me about the home you grew up in.
Let's see. My dad was a pastor, and so I grew up in a series of parsonages. And my mom was a minister's wife who had other part-time jobs, but her calling and her career in life was to be a pastor's wife. So the ministry was a pretty big deal in our home, and consequently, I hoped really deeply that I would be called to something other than the ministry. However, this is what I ended up spending the last 40 years doing. So anyway,
Well,
a
let's
happy
let's
home.
get more granular here because part
Okay.
of the problem with talking to pastors is that pastors have a series of set answers to common questions that
Ah,
we actually rehearse over and over and over again, and they come up in
I
our
was
pulpits. So
I'm good at that one.
where now he's talking about CRC parsonage. That's the Christian Reformed Church. Sometimes I just use CRC as
Right.
everybody knows, but often people, the Christian Reformed Church of North America, it's sort of an offshoot of Dutch Calvinism from a lot of immigrants that came over in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, yada, yada, yada. I have more videos on the Christian Reformed Church on my channel. Where was was this your father's first call? Where you were in the birth order?
I'm the oldest in our of the three sons in our family. I was born in Iowa. We lived in Lebanon, Iowa, and the population of the town went from 36 to 32 when our family moved away. So we were missed.
Where is Lebanon, Iowa?
Northwest Iowa, as I recall.
Okay, it's in that northwest
It's
area.
within driving. You get groceries in Sioux Center, if that gives a landmark.
Yeah. How long
So
was your father? Was that his starter church after
that
seminary?
was his first charge. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not
So
uncommon for CRC ministers to sort of have starter churches where they're
yeah.
right out of seminary. They've still got burrs from the seminary factory and they go into the first church and they spend usually 3 to 5 years in their first church just sort of
Yep.
getting their feet under them and then they go to a bigger charge. So you started in Lebanon. You
Yep.
probably don't remember anything from Lebanon.
Very, very dimly. I was like 3 when we moved away. So
Okay, what
um,
was the second place you moved to?
Jenison, Michigan. So a suburb of Grand Rapids, and actually it's about 20 minutes from where I live right now. And so my dad was there at Trinity Christian Reformed Church was the name of the church, and he was there for 6 years. And so I was there for me from when I was 3 till when I was about 9, heading towards 10.
Now okay, this is so much fun. Tell me, this is often what happens too. Tell me about where did your father and mother grow up, and where did they meet? And because there's a lot of parallels between Ron and I in a lot of different ways. So tell me some of
Yeah,
that.
actually, our parents were friends way back before we were.
That's very Calvinist of us.
Yeah, um,
So what year did your father graduate from Calvin Sem?
1962.
Okay, so he's a little younger than my father. My father graduated from Calvin Sem in 60, and my
Okay,
mother graduated from Calvin College in 60. So your
okay.
father graduated from the Sem in 62. Okay, well, did your parents were they both West Michigan kids or did they grow up somewhere else?
Actually, it's kind of a fluke that they met. My mom is from Pennsylvania, like the Harrisburg area in Pennsylvania,
Oh.
and Orthodox Presbyterian background,
Oh.
and pretty blue collar family. Like, her dad was white collar, but kind of everybody else in the family had a pretty blue collar mentality, and she never really fit in their small town or in the culture of the family, as it were. And so consequently, she wanted to go somewhere else for college and not just staying in that same little bubble. and I think they had. I don't really know this. They had friends or something who were familiar with the Christian Reformed Church, um, and actually, I think George Marsden was in their circles somehow. Maybe
Huh.
went to their church when
Interesting.
she was a girl or something,
Hmm.
and so was familiar with the Christian Reformed Church, and so somehow she got pointed towards it. Ended up exploring what Calvin might mean, and went to Calvin, sort of as a way of getting off on her own. And so um, she's not at all Dutch. She's not at all Reformed, or wasn't.
OPC isn't reformed?
Well, yeah, not Dutch Reformed. Hey, they don't
I
eat
love
Oli
it.
bone, okay?
Keep going. I'm sorry. That was just really
Sure.
funny.
No, no, you're not, but yes, I will. um, so, so let's see. So,
So your
in
father.
my dad grew up in Muskegon, Michigan.
Um,
Foundry worker's son. His mom was disabled, really bad rheumatoid arthritis all her life. Attended his seminary graduation in a wheelchair.
wow.
Um, and so that was kind of a defining issue. The other is his dad was an immigrant, immigrated from the Netherlands when he was like 6 years old or so. Very traumatic experience. Quarantined in Ellis Island without knowing the language and being
Oof.
separated from his parents and in Ellis Island, and so would never talk about anything. And it was traumatic enough in Holland that that's why they fled. So and grew up in a poor working class home in Muskegon, Michigan, which is a huge step up from what he was raised with. So that's sort of his background. He was the most jovial, happy-go-lucky, benevolent, patient man that I've ever known. And despite his childhood and despite the challenges his wife brought, he was quite a guy.
Wow.
And
When did he immigrate?
he was 6, so this would have been very early 1900s, 1900s somewhere,
Okay.
I think.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And so,
About the same as my great grandfather um, brought his great great grandfather over, and but that's about the same as my grandparents. So yeah,
okay,
yeah. I mean, Ron and I very much have very similar generations, a year or two different, but
yeah,
very similar. How long did your father stay in Jenison?
he was there 6 years.
Okay.
So I think um, I would have been like 9 or 10, like very early 70s when we moved. Our next church was in Lansing, Illinois.
Okay.
Um,
Well, tell me about those early years in Jenison. Did you go to Christian school?
yeah, Jenison Christian School was about a half mile from our house, and I think you could see it from the upstairs window. So
Was the parsonage right next door to the church?
yeah, it was
So
same
very.
kind of brick, same kind of brick as the church. So
Do
yeah,
you know much about the founding of Trinity CRC in Jenison?
I think it was an offshoot of the growth of some other churches in the area years prior, but I don't really know. Um, I don't know much about it specifically.
Okay, so see, I had a rather unusual childhood as a CRC minister because my
Right,
father spent 36 years in Patterson, which is
right,
not a typical CRC. You had a much more, there are many more children of CRC ministers that had growing ups like you did.
right.
And my father did too, just from one colony to the other. So for
Sure.
you, how was the move from Jenison to Illinois?
I don't remember much of it. It I was fairly young at the time, and I don't know. I didn't have a lot of significant friendships in our home in Jenison, so it wasn't real traumatic for me to leave. Um, I think what I did notice is socially, I think it was difficult for me being in Illinois. I had didn't have a lot of close friends in our area. I had kind of a turbulent social life relationships through those years. So it's not the junior high years, they're probably never easy for anybody, but um, they were. I don't look back and think, oh, that was really good. In fact, I don't know that I had that many years of the junior high stretch.
So where was this church in Illinois?
Lansing, Illinois.
Okay. Did you go to Christian school?
Yep, Lansing
Eh,
Christian School, and then to Indiana Christian High School for the first 3 quarters of my freshman year there.
okay. So is Lansing, you're going to have to forgive me because if you said South Holland, of course I would have recognized it,
Right
but
near
is
South Holland.
right near South Holland. So that's
Yeah.
sort of in that south of Chicago, CRC, that community that, you know, that really was there, or was it a little bit outside?
No, it's right in there. And if you take Interstate 80 heading west from Indiana to Illinois, you'll go right through Lansing.
Okay. Well, talk to me about what it was like being the preacher's kid for you.
Um, my my folks always made a pretty deliberate point, and they said to us often that we don't want you to do something or not do something because you're a preacher's kid.
Hmm.
And my dad kind of prided himself as not being similar, not being the same as other preachers in that subculture. So he kind of bristled against the uh, kind of the stereotype
Hmm.
of what a Christian Reformed pastor would be. Having said that, I think he fit it to a T. And so,
That surprises me not at all.
yeah,
So junior high, and then did your father take another call after that?
right, he did. And so, actually, my freshman year in high school, he took a call to Hudsonville, Michigan.
Oh wow, you're really
And I,
crossing the country here.
yeah,
Um, from
yeah,
Jenison to
from colony to
Chicagoland
colony.
to Hudsonville.
Yeah.
Woo!
And I should go back to the comment about my dad. My folks were very deliberate about making sure that um, they put Venetian blinds on the fishbowl that you live in if you're a pastor's kid in a parsonage. And so I think they really went out of their way to, I was never pressured with any expectations other than what a normal mom and dad with their values would try to pass on to their kids. So
Yeah.
the growing up in a parsonage anxieties about what will people think and so forth. I don't. They very deliberately try to lean away from those, and I think I pick some up, but I think it's more just my own anxieties and vulnerabilities and who my people come from.
Yeah. Well, I think if you had a lot of that experience, your life would not have been as it has been. I mean,
Yeah,
people, because I think both of us knew ministers' kids in the CRC who had a lot of that for whatever, whether it was their parents or their church or them or for whatever reason. I mean,
yeah,
we've seen that dynamic out there, and I don't get the impression that either of
yeah,
us have much of that at all in
yeah.
us. So you go to high school. So where did you go to high school?
Um, my freshman year, I went to Indiana Christian High School
Right.
in Lansing, Illinois.
Yeah.
But then spring vacation of my freshman year, we moved to Hudsonville
Wow.
in the Grand Rapids area.
In the middle of the school year, even.
Yeah.
How was that?
Um, well, like I said, I don't think I really felt socially comfortable, which is a pretty big deal in junior high, heading into high school. And so there were things I kind of missed leaving, but I don't remember that as being a real difficult transition. And what I do remember is just feeling a lot more at home at the circles of kids I spent time with or the activities I was involved in Michigan than I did in Illinois. And
Okay.
so for me, that was a pretty positive experience overall.
Okay. So talk to me about let's say your sense of your relationship with Christ. Boy, this sounds like a profession of faith question. So, so you had junior high and then high school. I mean, what kind of kid were you? Were you a pretty good kid or a rebel or, flesh that out a little bit for me.
Yeah, I was a pretty good kid all along, and the I got less so as I got older. I joked with somebody recently. I didn't start drinking till seminary.
Well, seminary can have that effect on one.
That's right. Yeah. But what I'm saying by that is I think
Right.
the with on the DISC, I'm high D, high C. It's the creative profile, and but what it as I understand it, it's one foot on the brake, one foot on the gas pedal, both to the floor, and so and I think that's one of the most helpful profiles I've found, at least for understanding what goes on inside my own heart, because what I often found is that the desire to not cause a problem and the desire to express all this stuff inside me were often at odds. And I think through my growing up years, they were kept, that tension was kept inside or kept curbed. And I
Mm.
think as I matured and became an adult, I became more aware of the fact that, no, this is how I feel, or this is what I think, and became gradually less aware of um, what other people might think or what expectations they might have for me, and still cared deeply about that, often too deeply, but um, but began realizing that there are certain things I need to do just to be me, um, and that I won't be the guy that, the rather curious being that God made me to be if I chameleon off of everybody else's expectations. And so I think um, the creative in me started coming out a whole lot more into adulthood as I worked through some of the process that I just described.
Yeah. Now I'll just do a little bit of background for people who don't know this insider language that you and I can very easily slip into. Profession of faith, adult profession of faith is something that often happened in the Christian Reformed Church, usually in high school years, sometimes earlier, sometimes later. The Christian Reformed Church baptizes infants, and then the assumption is that they would make a Christian Reformed young person would make adult profession of faith, and then at that point begin taking communion. When Ron and I were growing up, you didn't take communion after baptism. You took communion after profession of faith. And so, profession of faith, you had Heidelberg Catechism classes growing up to one degree or another. And the years that we grew up, that was sort of, whether that was mixed with Sunday school or a midweek class or something like
Hmm.
that. So tell me about when you made profession of faith and what that was like.
Um, I re Interestingly, I don't remember the evening I made profession of faith. I know
Hmm.
I went to a council meeting. It was right across the parking lot from our house, and I remember one of the elders was. There were three of us who had asked to come to the elders on that night. Two classmates of mine, and
How old were you?
17, I think,
Okay.
16,
Okay.
and the two memories I have of that experience. One was one of the elders who was the dad of one of the other kids I went with, who was a teacher in our school, and several times over the next 6 months, passed me in the hallway and asked a question about something that I had shared in that conversation, which is
Hmm.
just kind of cool. Like, hey, are you still feeling like da da da? Or
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
it was his way of saying, I remember what you said, and it meant a lot to me.
Hmm.
And that was kind of cool. So now, 40, 50 years later, I remember that.
Yeah.
Um, what I do remember is the night I realized that Christ was real.
Hmm.
For some reason, I picture being in my room, my bedroom, and I don't even know what happened, but it's like something, a bubble popped inside of me and surfaced, and suddenly I realized that there was someone out there. It wasn't just all this stuff that we were supposed to believe. And that was the night it switched from being principles I believed to being a relationship that I had. And it was a few months after that that I went and made profession of faith. But I don't really remember the evening with the elders, but I do remember that evening with a rust orange shag carpeting in my bedroom, um, encountering God.
Yeah. Well, these parsonages, they'd have to be remodeled every time a new dominie comes through. And some point in the 70s, that rush shag carpet, that was the thing to get. And so there it went into the brick house next to the church, and little Ron
Yeah.
had to grow up with it. It's the way it goes in a parsonage.
The scary thing is I may have chosen it because we had it done to redo as we moved in. So But we don't need to go there.
We don't need to go there. Um, when did you begin to feel a call to ministry?
um, During high school, I wondered about it.
Hmm.
My dad being a pastor and having a number of other pastors in previous generations in our family, um, the it was kind of always there as an option. And in my junior and senior years in college, I think I went with different career exploration programs that they had and so forth, and started to explore other kinds of opportunities. And kind of in the back of my mind was I was hoping that something else would take so I wouldn't have to do the minister thing. And some of that is my perceptions of church. Some of that was my perceptions of my dad's role, none of which were bad. Church was not a negative thing for me, and nor did I have a real negative view of my dad's role. I was not that kind of Dominie's kid sort of thing, to use the Dutch. But I think God made me to be a very different person than my dad,
Hmm.
and I would have died slowly trying to fill the roles that my dad filled really well.
Yeah.
And I'm just not wired that way. And so I think if I clicked on the word pastor, my dad's picture popped up, and I was kind of secretly afraid that God might be pulling me with an undertow toward that. And got to college, and I kept exploring different things. I think I was looking
Yeah.
at teaching and at law as well as ministry as
Yeah.
my sort of top three that I was pondering over. And I got to the end of my freshman year in college, and it was reaching the point where if I was going to go pre-seminary, I had to make a choice because of classes, language requirements I needed to have. And so Latin, I believe, was kind of the trigger for that. And so it kind of all came to a head. So interestingly, several things converged in that year, which was both hell for me personally and a really formative one for me. I needed to decide whether I was going to go pre-seminary or not, because by the beginning of the next year, I needed to start Latin. Secondly, I got to college and encountered, this was a Christian college, but I encountered a lot of much broader views than I ever did in Hudsonville, Michigan.
Hmm. Hey,
And
we're talking about Calvin College, right?
correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure we're talking about the same school.
Yeah. Well, gives you an idea how I experienced Hudsonville. If Calvin was spiritual fringe,
Please go on.
yeah. I've known for 25 years the kinds of things that can make you laugh, Paul. So I make them up as I go along. So yeah, it's kind of telling that was, spreading my wings and getting out of the subculture in our denomination school. But I think it was maybe more having to do with classes I was taking or kids from other backgrounds who were there.
Yeah.
And so things I never experienced in Unity Christian, where we were all kind of
United.
the same ice cube tray. And so so that one, that question came up and deeply affected how I felt about ministry. So that question about what am I going to do with my life for a career came up. I'd been dating a girl had been dating for several years, and it kind of reached the point where it was we were kind of at a
We're talking about Deb?
yeah.
Did you meet her in high school?
Yeah,
Okay.
we were neighbors in high school. We lived 3 houses. Her backyard was against the same church parking lot as mine was. And actually, the very first time my dad got a phone call from this church, now actually he turned down that call, but then 6 months later they came back. The very first contact from that church was Deb's dad. And so at our wedding reception,
People on the internet are not going to believe this, but Christian Reformed people who watch this video, many of them are going to be like,
my aunt and uncle had that. Um, but yeah, so there have been a lot of jokes over the years about an arranged marriage. Like my dad gave her dad a goat, and I could give her a ring, and um, but all that to say, a second major thing going on my freshman year of college was sort of a defecate or get off the pot point in our relationship. And a third thing is I encountered my first post-enlightenment questioning of God's existence in
Oh,
classes.
all at
And
once.
I wasn't yet a philosophy major, but
Yeah.
just enough of that that it kind of wigged me.
Huh.
And so I was smart enough, even at that age, to realize that I kind of needed to figure the God thing out before figuring out the ministry thing. And actually, it would really behoove me to get my worldview in order to propose to a girl and spend the rest of my life with her, or convince my parents of that at the age we were. Um, but that was quite a year for me because all three
Hmm.
of those were swirling around in my mind.
Hmm.
And interestingly enough, I don't feel like I really decided any of them. The God thing, I wrote papers on it and explored different, I worked really hard at that question and it didn't really seem to make any difference. I just
Hmm.
had killer papers. Um, but um, over the course of that year, it just seemed more and more silly that I even wondered that. Like
Huh.
it seemed like 4 in the morning debating whether the sun's going to come up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And five
Yeah.
in the morning, you're still not sure, but you're kind of wondering about it, and you're looking at the east more regularly. As 6 o'clock comes, depending on the time of the year, you begin to see something and you look away for a few minutes and you realize, oh wow, the sun came up. Never mind. And that was sort of the trajectory of that search for me.
Okay.
And so I didn't solve it. In hindsight, concluded that God had. Um, Similar thing with this girl I'd been dating, where it just felt like some of that same trajectory was going on through there. And as far as what I needed to declare for a career and therefore signing up for Latin classes, I just sort of lost interest in anything else. And so the others, it's not like I concluded that I don't want to do this or that. Um, it's more like they just kind of, oh, that's right. I was thinking about that at one point, but that doesn't seem like that much fun anymore. And so, and then there was one. And so my my coming to faith really happened in college, even though I professed it in high school.
Yeah. Yeah.
My deciding that this was the girl that God had given me, I didn't really decide that either. I kind of concluded it. And becoming a pastor was something that was sort of following that same trajectory. So,
Yeah.
three huge decisions I made in a very short amount of time, none of them really on purpose.
What dorm did you live in?
My first year, Schulte Eldersveld,
Oh, and your second year?
Rooks Dellen.
Oh, okay. Well, it says a lot to nobody else out there, I know, but
Okay.
it actually doesn't say very much at all.
Yeah.
So did you get engaged then?
Yeah. Um, my my sophomore year in college, Deb's freshman year, and we got engaged and then got married the following year.
Okay.
So
Okay.
we, by the time we married, we'd been dating for like over 4 years.
Okay.
Um,
All right. When did you say you got married? How long were you engaged?
just about a year.
Just about a year. Okay.
Yeah,
So you graduated a married man and you definitely started seminary a married man.
correct.
Okay. You were a philosophy major or a pre-sem major? Because at that time Calvin did have sort of a pre-sem thing, didn't they? Or did you need a particular
You declared a major
okay.
going in. So I think in the past, pre-sem had been a major,
Yes.
but by the time I was there, at least, you chose a major, but then there were seminary requirements that you needed to
Right.
have to be admitted to the seminary. So
And
it
what
was
was your major?
philosophy.
Okay. Okay. Well, tell me about that.
Um, I like to think, and I like to think about stuff that doesn't have immediate practical value. Um, And I I either the two options I was considering, one was English, an English major, the other was philosophy, and I I liked reading and writing, especially fiction, um, but but I also liked philosophy, and I think eventually it came down to two factors. One was it seemed like literature would simply mention stuff without necessarily getting into it. That was how it seemed to me at that age.
Hmm.
And so, like, why just kind of poke at things when you can really take them apart and think about them with
Yeah.
philosophy? The
Yeah.
other thing was that the philosophy major took, I think, three fewer classes it required than English did. So
Always the practical one.
made it a whole lot easier to get to graduate on time. So,
That's right. That's right, which I did not do. Um,
okay.
well, who were your favorite profs at Calvin?
um, I really like Nick Walterstorff in philosophy.
Yeah.
I just barely missed Alvin Plantinga as far as the philosophy greats at Calvin College. And I just thought the philosophy department was cool. I remember every Friday they would go out and play frisbee golf around the campus, all
Yeah.
smoking pipes and
Yeah.
playing frisbee golf, which I just thought was cool.
Yeah.
Um,
That's the
the
late 70s for those of you who don't quite
yeah,
know how old Ron and are. So yeah, late 70s, you'd see the
yeah,
philosophy department out there with their pipes playing frisbee golf.
yeah,
It's a very 70s thing to do.
yeah, yeah,
Calvin had a frisbee golf course, which I played a ton. We played ultimate frisbee. Frisbee was a very big deal,
yeah,
despite the
yeah,
weather. You could play frisbee golf in all sorts of weather.
yeah.
Um, and if you were going to go to Calvin College, you had to be able to do all sorts of things in all sorts of weather because it was all there. Then most of the
Yeah,
weather was not good,
yeah,
unlike California, Sacramento, you know, where that we both know.
yeah.
So, tell me about did you did you make a choice to do Calvin Sem, or was that just sort of the default choice because you didn't have alternate paths of ministry yet? So, tell me about that decision, if there
Yeah,
was
I
one.
think it was clearly the default. There wasn't a lot of social encouragement to consider other. Uh, it would have been kind of a fringe idea to go somewhere else in the Christian Reform subculture at that
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
Um, Another practical aspect to it is my wife Deb was a year behind me in school, and so for me to the only way for us to go to a different seminary would have been for us to move and for her to finish college somewhere else. And we had bought a house. We bought an old two-family house so that our downstairs tenants paid for our mortgage for us. And so
always the practical one.
that's right. Well, it was awesome. It was way cheaper than renting, and it
Yeah.
gave us a start.
Where was the house? What street was it on?
Near Lake and Fuller.
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah, yeah.
So Fitzhugh is the name of the street, just one block west of Fuller, and just one block north of Lake.
Okay, okay, okay. So, tell me about starting Calvin Seminary. What was that like?
Um, I was, let's see, um, I was fairly eager to enter seminary. I considered taking some time off between college and seminary, and like I had between high school and college, and decided not to just for the sake of momentum. And so, and then, so I was willing and positive, but not necessarily passionate, I would say, heading into seminary. And um, two things happened during my first 2 years at the seminary. I ended up going to seminary for uh, 5 years because I graduated from college in '85 and graduated from seminary in '90.
Yeah, we both
And
did. Yep.
um, and so in my freshman year, we had the very first preaching class, and and I was so excited about preaching. That was the thing that really stoked me.
Hmm.
And in what I discovered is I kind of sucked at it, and which given given my expectations and
Yeah,
and that was the thing I wanted to do,
yeah,
and given my emotional maturity, that was a completely unacceptable result. And so, but in reality, I think as I look back, it's kind of like if a baseball player tries too hard to kill a pitch. And what little I know about baseball is that if you try to hit it to the fences, you won't. And I think that was true of my approach to preaching back then. And you only got like three chances in junior preaching. And so, swing as hard as I could. And I just tie myself up in knots doing it. But nonetheless, that eagerness and the level on which that resonated with me, I think was pretty telling.
Mm.
The second thing was in my second year, I took an elective class on organizational systems in the local church. And it was taught by an instructor named Craig Van Gelder. And he was very big into systems. And that was my first exposure to something like that. And it simply blew me away. I remember it was a Tuesday, Thursday elective, and I'd walk out of there each afternoon session, and I felt like I was just drenched with sweat, like I needed a nap or a cigarette or a Diet Coke or something, and I didn't even smoke. And I think what resonated, I often thought back to why was that class such a passionate experience for me, and what it was thinking. I didn't know rancher versus shepherd kinds of leaders, and I hadn't learned that I'm very much a rancher, not a shepherd. And as a rancher, to discover that there's things you can do that affect how conversations happen, and to bring people into a conversation, but then steer it productively, so it's not just mass group anxiety, but rather to channel all that energy so that people together can find something more productive and actually closer to what Jesus died to launch with his church. That was just riveting for me. And so in hindsight, I look back at that experience with Craig Van Gelder as my call to ministry. And
Interesting.
I decided that God wanted me to head towards seminary earlier, and I knew I was passionate about preaching, but the breakout into sweat kind of intensity didn't really happen until I learned about this wonky thing known as organizational systems. And it was the rancher-ish way of looking at a group of people and recognizing if you change how the furniture is arranged, people will talk differently in the room. And that was the deal for me. And pretty much everything else I did in one way or another flowed downstream from that experience at that class on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Well, that really sheds a lot of light on a lot of things. Where were you and Deb worshiping?
We went to Eastern Avenue Christian Reformed Church for a little while, and then we spent close to 2 years, I think. I should check my math, at Church of the Servant.
Oh,
And so
okay.
this was back in Seymour School.
Yep.
Church of the Servant has a really nice building now, but they
Yep.
had deliberately chosen to meet in the school gym
Yep.
for the sake of simplicity,
Yeah.
which I respected. And I really appreciated Jack Rhoda's both his
Yeah.
leadership and his preaching.
Yeah. He's a
And
great guy.
and that was a great growing up in parsonages in West Michigan, kind of the colony churches. That completely rebooted my impression of what church could be. And from my point of view, that was as close to the early churches I'd ever been. And it really loosened up a lot of my expectation, my paradigm of what the word church could mean. And it was pretty formative for me. And then after my first year of seminary, I started the remaining 4 years of seminary. I was working at least part-time in other churches along the way. Um, and kind of how I looked at it is making my mistakes under supervision. But the first two was in the church known as First Jenison Church, which is not anymore.
Yeah.
But um, which First Jenison Church was nothing at all like Church of the Servant.
Yeah.
Um, but serving as youth pastor there, I learned that I'm not really gifted as a youth pastor, and I have a lot of respect for anybody who is, but that was not me. And secondly, an environment like that, I understood it having been raised in it, but that was also not where I belonged. So I was there for 2 years part time, and then I went to another church, um, Calvary CRC in Wyoming, with Doug Hamster was the pastor there,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I negotiated with them. They were looking for a full time intern for a year, and
Okay.
I negotiated a 2 year internship, which would fit with the rest of my class schedule. So if I took one class a term, a quarter, and worked full time there on their staff,
Yeah.
I could finish by 90. And so,
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny because how you modulated Calvin, how I modulated Calvin, and we modulated Calvin and the two Calvins a little bit differently so that we actually would sync up then again when we would take
yeah,
our oral comps in 1990. Oral comps. So at seminary, there was basically a Greek comp where you had to show a certain proficiency in Greek. There was a Hebrew comp, you had to show a certain proficiency in Hebrew. And then there was an oral comp where you basically had to show a certain proficiency talking theologically. And the oral comp was there was a Bible knowledge test too that,
yeah.
to their dismay, many seminarians failed. I had no problem with the Bible knowledge. That to me was easy. It's like, if have you read the Bible? Did you listen when your father was reading it after meals? I mean, come on, how hard is this really? But apparently, a lot of seminarians knew more theology than Bible.
Yeah,
But
telling but true.
so did you take then all of your field ed concurrently through seminary? Is that how you did
Right,
it? Okay.
right.
So you didn't
It was
have to go off to some place and do a
correct.
year someplace, which is of course really nice. After college, when did kids start coming?
Um, our last year in seminary, so 1990,
Okay.
January of 1990, our first son was born.
Okay. Okay. So I had seen Ra. I think Deb was in Norderweer one of the years that I was in Vanderwerp, and
Okay,
so I had seen you and Deb at college, and then Ron and I sort of crossed paths now and then before the oral comp. Usually, what a bunch of seminarians do is they sort of get a little study group together,
right.
and if anybody remembers the paper chase, that was this old program. About studying, doing law school. We sort of all compared notes and quizzed each other, and that's sort of how we prepared our. Did you pass your oral comp on the first time through?
Yep,
Yep, so did I. All right.
yep.
Well, our
Because
our
of the
team,
study group.
it was a good
Seriously,
study group.
that was a huge help. But yeah, I knew of you because I'd seen you around the college or at seminary, but being only kind of part time on campus in seminary, I didn't, you know, people that weren't in my classes, I didn't get to know real well. And so, as I recall, that was when I first got to know you, which would have
Yeah,
been 1990 then. So,
yeah,
and like, oh, I had fun with this Paul guy.
yeah. We had a good time.
Yeah,
Who else was in that? Was it Frank Guter? Was he in that group with us?
yeah, I think so.
I think Frank was. So when I started seminary, there were basically three seminarians who were North Americans and still single. Myself, Frank Guter, and Mark Van Heitzman. Now, so those of you who did the Northwestuary up in Olympia, Washington, Mark Van Heitzman is the pastor of that church. That's how I knew Mark. And Frank Guter. So Mark, Frank, and I had all been through, and I didn't have money for a computer, but I lived like on campus or close to campus, and so I would always type my papers in the student room myself. And Frank and the African students, of course, they had their wives back in Nigeria, but they were and so anyway, so you graduate from seminary so then you graduated in 90?
Correct.
Okay, see, I graduated in 91 because I still had a
Oh,
full year of student ed, and that's when we went to the Dominican Republic
oh, okay,
for
okay.
my seminary internship. So you graduate in 90, and then, well, tell me about the calling process. What did that look like for you?
Um, the you graduate and you're full of passion and experience of God, and you are brimming with confidence as to what you can provide for the church. And I'm saying that tongue in cheek, looking back at who I was back in those days. But I really wanted to get involved in established church revitalization. This goes back to the organizational systems and culture of the local church stuff that I was telling you about earlier. And so there were three churches that I'd been in fairly serious dialogue with and had interviews. One was in Cincinnati, one was in Kalamazoo, and one was right in Grand Rapids. And actually, there were two other seminarians that had basically the same set of three churches. And so one of them had a trio of three names that they were presenting to the congregation, and one had just two of us. But basically, we were a pool of three that went to these three churches.
Who were the other two seminarians?
John Zevelking.
Okay.
And Zach Anderson, I think.
Oh, yeah. Okay, interesting.
Right. I haven't talked to any of those guys in a long time, but
Yeah.
And as it turned out, we each got one of the churches. So again, most of the major decisions in my life, I don't feel like I've made. I feel like they've been kind of handed to me, and maybe it's God's grace to my ADD. But like, if you give this guy too many multiple choices, he'll just tie himself in knots. And so we'll just make it simple. So I got a call to a church in Kalamazoo, and the other two guys got the other two churches, and so in the fall of 1990, Deb and I and our infant son moved to Kalamazoo into a great big 4-bedroom suburban home right across the street from the church. And early in our time there, a delivery person or maybe a poll taker came to the door and knocked on the door and asked Deb if her mom was home. So
there's an age in which that's very welcome, and there's an age that isn't.
That's right.
So, well, tell me about what you discovered about yourself. Well, first tell me a little bit about the history of the church that you inherited.
In Kalamazoo?
In Kalamazoo, yeah.
Yeah.
Because that'll help give people a sense, because these Christian Reformed churches and these Christian Reformed church centers have a very peculiar history that really shapes who those churches are and what they do. So
let's see, Southern Heights Christian Reformed Church was maybe 3 or 4 decades old by the time I came to it. I think I was probably the 4th pastor there, as I recall, and had been, for most of its history, had been sort of a blue-collar overflow church. Like a couple of the major churches in Kalamazoo had grown big enough, and in lieu of an expensive building program or other changes, wanting to keep a sense of family at these churches, they said, well, we should start an overflow church. And so Southern Heights was sort of a geographical midpoint between these two churches, and it was in a good neighborhood for families and so forth.
And that's a very common CRC strategy. Right. CRC churches would often, they'd get to a certain point and it'd be like, how many people do we want in one church? Let's start another church. And there's just sort of a natural, where there's always tensions within church. And it's sort of like, well, these people, we've got enough people to have this emphasis. And especially when different waves of things come around, like in the 80s and 90s, there were all these worship waves and all these other things. And so then, like in places like Ripon that Ron knows as well, when churches sort of overflow, churches sort of also then start kind of their own little particularity. And it might be geography, it might be something else, but that's just sort of how the Christian Reformed Church grew, especially with the baby boom years.
Yeah. So through most of its history, Southern Heights Church had been a fairly quiet, blue-collar, largely tradespeople, I think, as far as the social climate. Kind of a group, and then some changes in the local economy. There was a large corporation outside town that had brought in some executives who ended up. So there's a number of executive types, PhDs and so forth, started coming to the church, and so within a half decade or so, you suddenly had a group of people who were much more wealthy and much higher education than most of the hoi polloi that had been the bread and butter of the church for years. And so, and what happened is that the tradespeople kind of yielded leadership to these executive types for whatever reason. I don't think it was anything forcible or intimidating. It was more like, oh, sure, they're good at running meetings. We'll let them do that. And and so by the time I came there, there were the people in leadership were largely executive. We
Hmm.
had several PhDs just in the council, um, and very few in the rest of the church.
Hmm.
Um, just as a little factoid. Um,
That's not a small thing in a church, though,
no,
depending on how those two social classes relate to one another.
right. And another uh, culturally significant development was a year before I came. Um, the electronic organ in the church gave out. It was getting worse and worse, and eventually needed to be replaced. And so, a year before I came there, apparently there was a congregational meeting to decide what to replace it with. And for the tradespeople, and I'm using these as a real rough demographic
Oh,
here.
I totally know where this is going.
Okay. For the blue collar folks, the electric organ was fine. You know, plug it in, we're good. And for the upper crust folks, like they really wanted a pipe organ.
Yeah.
And in the middle of a rather heated congregational meeting, as I've heard the story, um, debating what to do with this, they were grappling with the fact that a pipe organ would cost twice as much as an electronic organ.
Yeah.
And so the sentiment seemed to be leaning towards just go with the electronic organ. And the chair of the meeting, which is from the smaller but more vocal group, um, announced that an anonymous donor had agreed to pony up matching funds so that now you had the pipe organ would cost the congregation the same amount as the electronic organ. And in hindsight, now as I've heard the story and as I lived through the aftermath of it, um, I got to tell you all that to tell you this. um, the It's sort of like being told that you can have above ground pool in your backyard, or you can have an Olympic sized swimming pool. They're both the same cost. And on the one hand, that's a bargain. On the other hand, it sure dominates the backyard. And
And that would not be the only Christian Reformed church that would have a pipe organ that would dominate the backyard. I remember one pastor here in this classis. I don't know if he's even still alive. I remember him telling me, "Yeah, my church, we worship Baal." Baal stands behind me, behind the pulpit every Sunday morning, and we hear from him. I mean, he said something to that effect. And yes, indeed. And of
yeah.
course, it's so interesting hearing that story now, because of course, looking back on it, if you've sort of lived these layers in the Christian Reformed Church, I mean, a church of a certain type would aspire to a really amazing pipe organ. To have a Christian Reformed church with a pipe organ was of a different status, but
Hmm.
those classes also have sort of their own statuses that, as we should remember, we're moving from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s to the aughts, and sort of the long story of church in America, like the mainline cathedral pipe organ church, that was sort of the ideal of the mainline. Now there's going to be this neo-evangelical movement that's going to come along underneath and really disrupt this thing. So I've never
Yeah.
heard this pipe organ story before. This is fascinating. So keep going.
Okay. Okay. So like, sure, why not? All right, we'll get the pipe organ. And so they did. I didn't know any of this when I was interviewing to come in.
All right. You come into
And
a church, you just dumb and young and happy. Ooh,
yeah,
it's a church, it's a job. I get paid. I get to live next door to the church. What could be better? We can live with one car.
right. So anyway, what we ended up doing, the church was kind of at a crossroads, and I
Yeah.
heard clearly that there was underlying dissonance in the church as far as who are we and what is our church really all about. And so questions that were bigger than any one council meeting or any one congregational meeting to talk about. And it was sort of like, well, it was sort of like exactly what I'd been dying to get into. And like help people have a productive conversation about things that are too big to just talk about over coffee. So we laid out a 2-year process, basically implementing the stuff I learned in that class
Yep.
plus what I found elsewhere. And I got the prof who taught the class to help me kind of design the process. But it was a consensus-based, information-driven, consensus-based congregational vision casting process. And so it wasn't a pitch to the congregation of what the pastor or what the pastor and a few other leaders thought should happen. It wasn't poll results as far as, just survey indicates people want this. And so, but it was like, let's take a better, I think it was about a year and a half, maybe just a long year of group process to help people work through the underlying questions that lead to the kinds of things that we need to decide on specific plans for. The process I thought went really well. We had pretty impressive publications that came out of it. One was like a discussion guide. These are like 30-40 page booklets. Discussion guide of here's the data that our task force, we had to put a task force system. These are our people have dug up on our history, on our finances, on our community, how Kalamazoo has changed, etc. And so this whole process and stuff to talk about. And then the second was the results that came out of those discussions and what the task force in charge of it all was proposing back to the congregation. So a very credible process. And it came back and it was overwhelmingly approved by the congregation. It was just a very cool experience. And then a few months later, just as everybody's breathing a big sigh of relief, all sorts of excrement hits the fan. And I
Yeah,
remember,
because this is a wonderful plan. Well,
yeah,
let's implement it. Huh?
and actually the plans laid out in the process were not really that different from what we've been doing. It was the intentionality of it that kind of wigged people out.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
like, and so two things that come to mind. One was one of the blue collar tradesman types who was actually a neighbor of ours saying to me once, I thought that was all great. I thought it was sort of like at the company he works for. They'll tell us things that, cheer us on with goals they want us to be thinking about and stuff, but, we don't really do them. They just kind of say that at the company Christmas party kind of stuff.
Gives the
And,
executive something to do.
yeah. And so it's like you say these things, they're like slogans, but you don't really do. I didn't think we were actually going to do them, is what I remember him saying to me. And as an electrician, that just was, out of his experience range. The other thing was we actually weren't talking about changing that many things, but the level of intentionality was huge. Instead of kind of dabbling in other kinds of songs in the evening service when it doesn't really matter and we just, take requests kind of thing, we'll plan a blended style of worship and underneath both of those was doing it. The big thing was a switch in focus from what we want for our church to what people in our community might feel comfortable with.
Right.
And it was the shift in ownership from this is our church to do with it the way we want to we're going to think about them out there, whatever much or little we know about them. and that's what really wigs people out.
Yeah.
And and I didn't really appreciate this at the time, um, but the the experience of having our church be here for them was, even if it was really biblical, it was really foreign.
Yeah.
And there were, for a lot of people, everything was wrong and nothing was wrong. And and so we lost a lot of people. Some because they were uncomfortable with the changes, although the changes themselves were pretty modest. Um, Others, more of them, because people they really thought a lot of were uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And so they followed others out.
Yeah.
And at the same time, um, there were some unchurched friends of members who had started to come, as well as other people in the broader Kalamazoo area who had heard there was a church that was beginning to try something other than the pipe organ, and they
Yeah.
were curious about that, and so they started coming as
Yeah.
well. And and so consequently, it began a migration out and in. And 2 years later, it was a very different congregation than it had ever been before.
Yeah.
And we were all pretty tired.
Well, it's, and it's so helpful to remember that, in the 90s, of course, Kalamazoo was changing. Kalamazoo, of course, was Kellogg's, or Battle Creek is not too far from
Yeah,
Kalamazoo. Parts, auto parts. I mean, Kalamazoo is but these places in West Michigan are changing. You have the seeker movement. Bill Hybels, who grows up in Kalamazoo
right,
in the Christian Reformed Church, of course, gets involved in this youth ministry in Chicago,
right.
and then plants his church with 700 of his closest friends, and makes Willow Creek sort of changes the
Yeah,
trajectory, a safe place to hear a dangerous mission, which of course sounds really funny now. Um, you know, World-changing disciples of Jesus Christ. I mean, all the seeker stuff where you have this change in focus, which, especially thinking back on it, for an immigrant denomination that comes over to the New World, and they're not thinking missionally. Their mission is to provide for their own and to maintain for themselves the pure church
right,
that they fought so hard against the state church to have in the Netherlands. And part of the demographic reality of what birthed the Christian Reformed Church is that the Christian Reformed Church is sort of mostly made up of these secessionists out of the state church in the Netherlands, often in the north, Groningen, Friesland, all these. They come to America and they just huddle up, and church is their thing. And through the baby boom, they really prosper, and they have their Christian schools and they have their high walls. And then comes along this whole new group of people that says, well, the mission of the church is really missional. It's to the rest of the world. And you had a sense of that in COS and its own. COS really wasn't really a seeker church. It's much more of sort of, let's say, a philosophy church where they're playing with liturgy, but it is very
right,
intentional. And they're and of course COS in the 70s, it's also, you've got some of that. They aren't necessarily Jesus movement type people out of the Bay Area, ex-hippies and drug addicts, but they are sort of young, idealistic, very intellectual, intelligent, and they're really, with a lot of intentionality, shaping the church. You get to the seeker movement, and now, well, we're going to have, Granite Springs when it gets planted. Another son of Kalamazoo, Kevin Adams, who I've done his story. You can find it in the archives on the channel. If you just search Paul Vanderklay, Kevin Adams, it'll probably come up. So he comes to Granite Springs, and when I come out here to California, they have their seeker service on Sunday mornings. They have their believer service on Wednesday nights, and that's when they have communion, not Sunday mornings, of course. That has changed wildly at Granite Springs and many of the other churches since then. So you're right there at the cusp of this change, and you're actually applying it. And at this point, we look back on it, it should come as a surprise to nobody that, wait a minute, if you change the mission of the church, a whole bunch of people who have basically been in the church and they've been happy with the mission, and basically they've been the center of the mission. You flip that around, and suddenly it's like,
Right.
wait, what? And especially after they just bought a pipe organ, they had arrived, and now, you're switching the cheese on them. And so, well, tell me what you learned about yourself in that process.
Um, I think a lot of what I learned about myself didn't really surface until later, looking back on it. But I think one is I learned that change management is really of interest to me.
Hmm.
Um, I'm I don't I don't want to make changes myself. Like to give me that, I can do that better than you can, kind of, or even just here, let me help with that. That's not me as much as let me help you so you can make changes and lead others in changes. Um, and so equipping and changing a system, I learned really excites me. And even though a lot of the things it involves are really difficult or painful, um, but working at the level of organizational culture
Yeah.
um, is is really satisfying for me. And about that time, I started working in a doctor of ministry and organizational culture, which just gave me a chance to dig further into all of that. And I had a book I wanted to write, but then I ended up leaving the program because we left the church to go to start planting another church. And so I never got to do the thing that I was driving the doctor of ministry. Um, but um, what I learned about myself was positively, I'm not only do I really enjoy working on the level of organizational culture and helping people restructure conversations that have been either threadbare or gridlocked, but I'm pretty good at it. Um, and I think to be able to be a non-anxious presence in the middle of that kind of anxiety, um, it not that I did everything perfectly, as I look back on it, but it was about as good of a process as you could have had for a church like that to work through questions and struggles like that. Um, Secondly, I think I learned how I handle stress and pressure.
Hmm.
I think I submerged a lot of the pain I was feeling through those years
Hmm.
because, under the pressure of that moment, I'm doing what you have to do, and we'll feel this later. And
Yeah.
I didn't feel it till later, and I think that was tough.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
but
it's not, it's fun theorizing change, but for especially, if you've got a change is seldom a lot of fun for people. Well, some people like it, but some people don't. And I think churches, for the most part, often attract people who don't like a lot of change. And that's especially true if you get a church, like a church at the beginning, a new church, you'll tend to attract people who like change because they're going to make a change.
yeah,
But if you've got kind of a long church that begins to, let's say, hit a downward slope, and the Christian Reformed Church sort of peaks in the late 90s in terms of overall, and there's a lot of demographics and a lot of things that go into that. But as churches begin to sort of diminish in size, the the temperament profile of the people who stay and of the people who go, that those temperament profiles are really going to change because people who don't want to change are going to stay, and people who like changing are going to leave. And so overall, your group is going to increasingly be made up of people who really don't want to change.
right,
And then if you come in and say, let's change, they'll look for their guns.
yeah,
Um, and theoretically, of course, and
yeah,
that's they'll find their voice. We could say it that way. They will
yeah,
find their voice, and they
yeah,
will express those their voice at a congregational meeting, and to their neighbors. So that's how church people work. Well, so then you come, and I remember because Kevin and I are already out here in Sacramento, and uh, Tim and Chuck have already planted River Rock. I still have to have Tim on the channel. I should have Chuck on the channel too. Chuck's really doing wonderful things out in Oakdale right now. It's
Okay.
really fun watching Chuck do that ministry there. And so then you come out to Sacramento, and boy, changing thing is one thing. Well, let's start it fresh. So tell me about that.
Um, the let's see. I really thought God had always wired me for established church revitalization. And as tough as that was in Kalamazoo, I really felt like that's sort of where I fit. And version of the story is I was involved in dialogue with a church that was really on the ropes and looking to make some changes. And it kind of seemed like a perfect fit. And began to dialogue with them some more. And went there for a visit. They were about ready to vote to extend me a call, and we did an overnight visit with a bunch of meetings and talked to folks. And it just felt so wrong. Like, not the church, nothing wrong with the church, but it just was not where we belonged. And it felt like putting your shoes on the wrong feet. And it's just like, they're the right shoes, but it just feels terrible. And that was a very confusing experience. And soon after that, we were scheduled to go to an assessment center for Christian Reformed Home Missions, which was their on-ramp for church planting. And we really thought that God would call us to an established church needing revitalization. But it seemed like that was a good check on the process. And so I went to the assessment center, and my wife Deb and I did, and it was like a 36-hour experience or something, or maybe 72 hours. Pretty intensive, going through all these simulations and very exhaustive. And I really thought by the end of it that they would come back and say that established church revitalization is just kind of where you're fit. That's your sweet spot. And in fact, the sample sermon that you gave as one of the simulations was the grand reopening of a church. I explained it was going to be a message for a grand reopening of a church. Hear me present this passage that way. And they came back, and the recommendations was that I plant a church, and that I do it in a place where there was a cluster of other church plants, so I wouldn't do it alone, and that I pursued doing it as a multi-staff church start. And so, long and the short of it, there was a couple of places that might possibly be that, one of which was right in the backyard of this church. Whose heart I just had broken. And so that would have been awkward. And another one was Sacramento, California, Northern California. So the next week, Deb and I were on a plane going to Sacramento, and it was exactly the opposite of the experience of what we had had the previous week. And so through that, God called us to Sacramento, where every person I tried to build bridges with to come and be a staff partner with me fell through. And so my wife and I are both introverts, me especially. And so here we are, two introverts being sent into a non-nucleus church plant.
Yeah.
And that was the start of it.
Oh, um, you did better than you made it sound.
That's the
Well,
Calvinist in me coming out.
that's right. And at that time too, in the Christian Reformed Church, there was a lot of focus on church planting. The Christian Reformed Church, I mean, people were already sort of starting to feel the decline, even though numerically it wasn't measured. There was a lot of, for a whole variety of reasons, there was a fair amount of centralized money that was available. Our classis had a good amount of money. Ripon was very excited about church planting, not in Ripon. And so many of those churches were happy to fund church planting in Sacramento. And Kevin was a little ahead of us at seminary.
Right.
Tim was a little behind us. You and I were there basically at the same time, but didn't. And so we had a group of us, and then we very quickly brought in a group of interns and residents, and I mean those were kind of
Like the
the
next generation.
yep, yep. And we were off to the races. And you planted a church in a movie theater up north of town. I'm in the southern end of town. Um, um, the gathering went about 10 years, right?
Yeah, 11. We were in Northern California 12 and a half years,
Okay.
and the gathering went for like 10 and a half years, I think.
Yep, yep, yep. What did you learn about yourself as a church planter?
Boy, I think number one, I learned a lot about trusting in
Mm,
God. Um, it seemed, yeah, if you have 10 years, that's 120 months. And it seemed like most of those months, I was convinced this might be our last month. And
that, I want to tell people that's normal for church planters and church plants. So
but my
people will
point
hear
is
that
that's
and be a
not,
little surprised, but it's I heard it all the time. So
yeah,
anyway, go on.
but that's not normal for me.
That's
Um, the I'm a planner, I'm a long-term thinker, and I'm a strategist. And so the crap, what are we going to do now? Kind of sentiment is a very foreign and uncomfortable feeling. I mean, it's not comfortable for anybody, but um, and so I need to help. I needed to have people help me think that way. But nonetheless, there was always this sense of dangling from a thread with that. Um, at the same time, it gave a tremendous amount of freedom. And so if you need five or six things um, to make a situation work, and you've only got two things, well, what can we do with these two things? And figuring that out, um, and just dealing with a tremendous amount of creativity that you can use. Um, this was in the age of church drama, and so we did a lot of stuff that was actually very cool. And um, I think on Easter we had a drama of people who see dead people, and it was somebody who talks to truck driver talks to Elvis, or um, but then somebody else who talks to Jesus, and it was kind of set up the Easter message. And so if you could do really hard hitting gospel preaching on stuff that didn't feel like it, um, finding the gospel according to different popular musicians. That was pretty cool. Stuff that, you didn't have to ask for permission. It was a movie theater. You just do it. Um, and so that was very cool, and really grew me as a leader. And also, I think, my area of special interest throughout my leadership, whether I've been able to say it or not at the time, has been organizational culture. Being able to help a group of people develop and maintain a healthy culture in the church. And if a group, a church, or whatever other group has a healthy, self-aware sense of their culture, um, they'll be very healthy over time, and they can work together to respond to almost any challenge that comes along. If they're not very self-aware, or if they don't know what their culture is, they're not going to be able to respond to changes in a way that allows them to be themselves in a new season or a new setting,
Yeah,
and that will leave them very vulnerable.
yeah.
And what ended the gathering after a while was, um, we had a team member come in and several other people who kind of resonated with him, who didn't fit the culture in the rest of the church. And the church was small enough and fragile enough that was just that was too difficult for it,
Yeah,
and it took a toll on everybody.
yeah,
One of the things through those years is just realizing how profoundly important the culture is of a local congregation, and how difficult it is to describe it, because it's like asking a goldfish to describe water.
yeah, yeah. Well, I have to keep an eye on the time here because, and actually, I know. Because when Ron comes to Sacramento, that's when we start to get to know each other, and then we'd had conversations through a bunch of things. You would take another church, and then you would do some specialized transitional ministry. You did two churches as STMs.
Correct.
Okay, and then um, you get sick, which really surprised me because you're my same age, and you've always been sort of a healthy guy. Um, well, talk to me about what happened.
Um, Through the very early 2000s, I started having more and more weird symptoms, like um, I couldn't walk very well. I couldn't walk very fast, and especially 2001 into 2002, um, like my wife and I would go for walks at night, and I couldn't keep up with her. And I remember one time in late 2002, we were going for a walk and seeing senior citizens behind us, like 80-year-olds, and trying really hard to not have them pass me on the bike path. And it's like, this is really embarrassing. I'm not that old. And other other weird, apparently unrelated symptoms. Anyway, it seemed like I was just having more and more of a difficult time doing my ministry stuff. Writing sermons was about killing me every week, and so I finished my 18-month contract in Madison, Wisconsin, and came back to the place we would stay in West Michigan here in between contracts. Deb and I decided I would take a little bit longer just because I was pretty burnt out and just get on top of whatever was going on. Anyway, it got worse and worse, and eventually I had a physical, and a doctor said, I think you should talk to a specialist about this or this. And so we went to this specialist who then spotted that it was hydrocephalus going on. And arterial venous malformation, I think is what it's called. But basically, there was the place in between the hemispheres in your brain that's supposed to drain brain fluid down into your spinal column had been slowly closing over my lifetime, and it had reached a critical point where I was getting excess pressure of brain fluid in my head, and so the scan of my brain showed, instead of the brain being like this on the two sides, it was like this, and it was just this big black hollow in the center, which was the fluid displacing until the brain was just scrunched up against it, and that's why I couldn't think very well at all. Long story short, I was having a harder and harder time walking and thinking. I'd bump into walls going through doorways, bladder control problems. My speech was really clumsy and slurred, and it was getting scary bad. And the day after Christmas of 2002, I had surgery, drilled a hole in my head, and went up on the top over here, put a shunt in that drained it down into my abdomen, and that gave an alternate access or venting for the fluid in my brain. And I came out of surgery, and I talked to Deb through the anesthesia, and my voice sounded like me again. And that was an unforgettable moment for her.
Mm.
Felt much better, except for the bad haircut and back. And a couple of weeks later, actually, I flew out to our oldest son and his wife in Southern California and helped them with some household projects, 2 different weekends in a row. And was coming back through O'Hare Airport, and I missed my last flight from O'Hare to Grand Rapids, Michigan to get back. And I woke up having been napping in the walkway at O'Hare. I looked at my phone, and it had been blowing up with a whole bunch of calls from my wife, who, when I got the messages, was really pissed that I missed my flight. And but as I was talking, it wasn't making any sense at all. Eventually, she realized that something had gone wrong. And so staying on the phone with her, and then also calling security, they got me to a camera who then they could see where I was. And pretty soon some really nice policemen came and put me on a stretcher and hauled me to a hospital. And the next morning, my wife and sister-in-law drove from Michigan to Chicago And we drove back to Michigan, my wife's hand holding my head up because otherwise I would flop over in the back seat. And that led to several weeks of a hospital stay and a repeat of the whole shunt procedure. And that happened yet again through the spring. And so by summer, I was on my third shunt, which is the one that's still in. And I made it through the first couple of months of high risk. And, but my brain had really taken a beating. And there was a lot of things that I could do before that I couldn't. And it took about the next year was slowly regaining a lot of mental function, balance, ability to walk, ability to talk. I wasn't driving. It was kind of like a year of house arrest. And initially I was dumb and happy, but after a while I realized I'm just not having much fun. And about 6 months ago, I was pretty much back to normal. And we bought a house, a 150-year-old house, and I've been done a ton of work, excuse me, a ton of work fixing it up, which has been really good for me. And now the list of projects is starting to taper off, and I'm getting ready for what's next, and I'm not exactly sure what's next.
Yeah. What did you learn? What happened? You know, it's very famous in the book of Job. Job suffers all these losses, and his wife says, "Curse God and die." Deb didn't say that. But Satan then says, "Skin for skin." Strike someone's health. And, I've often found that to be true, that you can have a lot of calamities go, but as long as you sort of have mind and body and everything's working okay. So what happened to you spiritually with this sojourn into illness, which was very new for you? You'd always been healthy.
Yeah, yeah. Um, it's interesting for me. I think what I understand of my wife's experience was that this was
mm,
brutal. And
that's often the case.
I'll tear up saying this
Yeah.
part, but she talked about driving to the hospital with praise music on as loud as she could just because she needed that
Yeah.
to see her husband like that.
Yeah.
And I still cannot imagine um, how distressing it had to be for her to be looking at not only her husband but her future
Yeah.
um, in a semi-vegetative state in a hospital bed,
Yeah.
and not have any guarantee that she has anything other than a future of changing diapers ahead of her.
Yeah.
She had a new job that she was really enjoying that she had to take a leave from, and that's Deb's side of it.
Yeah.
On my side of it, in those years, or those months, I was dumb and happy. I didn't really know, and so I really, people talk about fearing like Alzheimer's or something, or
Yeah.
dementia, and I don't want to minimize that, but in my own experience of temporary loss of clarity, I was just kind of whatever. Look at the pretty trees out the window. Um, but that's so not who I've always been.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
over the next 6 months, 9 months, I began to regain a lot more function,
Yeah.
and physical therapy and stuff like that. It helped a lot, of course. Um, and so over the past 6 to 12 months, so late 2004 into now 2005, I've actually found that much more difficult because I'm waking up and realizing, crap, I lost my career, or
Yeah.
crap, I lost this, or I lost that,
Yeah.
or
Yeah. Yeah.
this wasn't. And I kind of the way I've come to think of it is this: if my life was a really tough basketball game, I still thought we could win.
Yeah.
And I was so looking forward to cheering mid-court at the end of a really hard-fought basketball game.
Yeah.
And late third quarter, the coach calls me out of the game, just wants me to sit on the bench next to him. And that's where I spend much of the fourth quarter. And I'm not into sports, but I love sports analogies. And that's what it feels like to me. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, put me in, coach. I'm ready to play, to get John Fogerty on it.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what God has in the future. I love the church that we're in right now, and
Yeah.
I fit really well there. I'm preaching there roughly once a month, which has been a really good thing. Um, and I would love to be involved in coaching and consulting all along. A lot of my best fruits grown in other people's trees.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't know exactly what I'll do with the time that I have, but I have quite a bit of pretty healthy time left in my story. And so right now I'm just, uh, my Lenten practice this year was to not worry about my future employment. And so I've spent the last month not worrying about that. So
Well, it kind of makes Easter going to be a bummer. It's like, oh, now I get to worry again.
I'm going to binge on anxiety.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure this is the kind of fasting that Although I always thought I said this in the live stream the other day. I always looked at these New Englanders, and it's like, yeah, we're gonna stop eating hamburgers and we're gonna start eating lobster and fish, and it's like this is fasting. You know, hamburgers. I mean, if I was eating lobster and fish all year long, Lent would be for hamburgers. But
Yeah.
so, well, and you're in a very, you're in a. I think a funny thing has happened to the, let's say, um, I don't know, how would you describe now 50s and 60s for an American man these days? When my grandfather, who not my grandfather was a minister. For ministers, it's different too because, my one grandfather worked in a machine shop. And so, well, he was a foreman, so it wasn't, very heavy physical work. My other grandfather was a minister. But I've seen it was interesting because in the early aughts, I noticed that a lot of men who are living around here, we have Intel or had Intel in Folsom, you know, West Michigan too, people don't realize has a fair amount of fairly high. It might be furniture, but it's fairly high tech furniture. And West
Yeah.
Michigan is a fairly entrepreneurial area. Those Dutchmen, know how to make a lot out of a little. That's kind of what they do.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that I think in past generations, once you get into your 50s and 60s, and now even, given longer health, 70s, you would sort of imagine the sweet spot of your career. And I remember seeing all of these guys laid off from Intel and EDS in Sacramento, these technology companies, all these guys laid off in their mid 50s. And at that point, they're sort of outsourcing all kinds of things to India. And
Yeah.
then you wind up and it's like, well, I'm just, this should be like some 55 to 65, one might imagine. This will be really the peak of my career.
Mhm.
And what we've seen a lot of culturally, um, ministerially too, especially partly because I think the seeker move and then the emergent movement where everybody sort of wanted young pastors because the anxiety point of the church were young families. And so the thinking was, well, let's get a young pastor in so we can attract young families, which I don't really think necessarily, does the job. But
Mhm.
there's something to it. Um, we've seen so much change on so many levels that um, I think ministerially in the Christian Reformed Church, a lot of people our age are sort of hmm, didn't quite expect to be in a position like this.
Mhm.
Um, Although it isn't, I mean, I think if you wanted to go, yeah, but given your medical history and stuff, I think, probably just getting a call in a church, you might not want to do that. And even for me, I could, if I decided I were going to leave Living Stones, and every time I say that, there are people that hear that is like, um, my father did that when he was like 4 or 5 years from retirement. He had
All
spent
right.
all that time at Northside, and then so he went to Baldwinsville and had one more church, and then Then he went to Massachusetts and, of course, kept doing what he had always done until he dropped dead. But that's just who he was. And well, I mean, your father similar. I mean, both of our fathers sort of pulled from that same generation. Your
Right.
father also, in retirement, kept, interim pastoring and working with this and working with that.
Yeah.
And what year did your father then die?
He died 7 years ago, so that would have been 2018, early
Okay,
2018, I
that's right. He
think.
died the same year my sister died. That's right. So we get to this point, and this didn't quite work out the way. And of course, our templates in some ways were our father's generation.
Right.
And so we sort of watched our father go through this, and we're in the same vocation. So we think we're going to, and no, no, that's not what's happening. And
Yeah.
in fact, in the Christian Reformed Church, I mean, things are quite disrupted. I mean, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, Grand Rapids was sort of the center. West Michigan was very much the center of the denomination. And 50 years ago, the height of one's career would have been to aspire to be a denominational bureaucrat, you know.
Right.
And all of this stuff has been disrupted. And now you've got the unfortunate situation of not only are you in a time of disruption in terms of your vocation and career, but you're in a time of you just had this major medical thing, which things are looking good. They've held for a while. You've got good confidence. They should continue to hold, but I mean, that gives people pause because how do we know it won't come back? Well,
Yeah.
you can't know, but you could die of a heart attack too. I mean,
Yeah.
I had my father and my sister do that, surprising
Yeah.
everyone. So we've always got that. We do live in the age of decay after all. Um, well, well, talk to me about what you've got, you came into the ministry same time as me. You're going to retire about the same time as me. We're both, did you turn 62 already?
No, in a couple of weeks.
Okay, okay. So you're just a few months older than I am.
Yeah.
Um, so what
And
would
I
you
gotta say, I'm feeling it too.
So you got like another 5 years until formal retirement. Um, what kinds of things what would you like to see in these years?
Um, I would, if I had a magic wand to wave, um, I would love to have chances to coach and consult, and also chances to write. Um, the and some of those are tied into preaching and coaching leaders. Like I've said to the pastor at our church, to Joy, I don't want her job. Like it really doesn't sound good to me to, you know, follow up on want ads for senior pastor gigs.
Yeah.
Um, and not that I couldn't, or that God might not prompt me in a way that I don't feel right now, but helping other senior pastors figure out what they're trying to do really excites me.
Hmm.
And so the line that I've said all my life is my best fruit growing in other people's trees. And uh, and so the helping other people figure out what God's up to and what it would look like if they responded has just always, and I've done coaching for 10 or 15 years in different churches or pastors, and um, and I've really enjoyed that because it gives me a chance to kind of work on a high level without getting caught in the weeds of implementation. And I think God's given me the ability to smell what he's up to in a situation and tease out some of those things with the right questions. And so doing that and then writing in a way that um, can lead people to look at some of the same things differently.
Mhm.
And so I've got maybe 5 books that are in various stages of development tucked away in my laptop that have not come near to the point of seeing the light of day yet. Over the years that I've kind of chipped away at. So I would love to have a chance to do some of those, um, but I don't really know what it is right now, and
Yeah.
I'm choosing till Easter to not think about it too much.
I guess I'm getting in the way of the fast.
Yeah.
Um, well,
Yesterday was Sunday. You're supposed to skip your fast on Sunday.
well, there we go. I've pestered you, Ron, and I know that I mean, one of the things I realized as I was going through this is, to a certain degree, knowing more about you means, in some ways, it extends the conversation because I have more curiosity, because there's more niches that I was like, oh, what about this? What about this? What about this? But I will leave you alone now from my own nosy self, and give you a chance. I don't. What is there something you want to talk about, or something you'd like to ask, or something you'd like to say? The floor is yours. Uh-oh. And Zoom and Western Michigan. Oh boy. Okay, I'm gonna pause it right there.
All right.
All right, we had a Zoom lapse, but he's back. So Ron, anything you want to say, or anything you want to ask me, or anything you want to for the last little bit here, what say you?
I think um, my bent has always been strategic direction setting kind of thinking. That's part of who I've learned God's made me to be. And my experiences over my adulthood, but especially over the past several years, have just been reinforced in the direction of um, discovering with a new just how little we know, and just how firmly God has us in His hands. Um, and I guess for a direction setter, that's really difficult for me to say.
Hmm.
Um, and that's part of what God's been working on with me of late through the past couple of years, and so things that all along I've preached or exhorted people to believe in, on genuinely, but also with an element of cliche, um, that God has a plan, and what is God's will for us, and finding out, and the I for me, I haven't really had to grapple with how much trust I have in God's plan, until His plan clearly ran counter to mine,
Hmm.
and and apparently irreversibly counter to mine.
Yeah.
And so, and I know a lot of people have situations like that, but I hadn't. I'd had, you know, one of my passions has been sailing, and they talk about with boats, there's a big difference between a hole above the water line and a hole a hole above the water line and a hole below the water line. And the one is a problem you should fix, and the other is something you can't sail with because you won't make it back to the dock.
Yeah.
And the this feels like a hole below the water line as far as
Hmm.
who I always thought God had made me to be.
Yeah.
And so several things. So if this is the early fourth quarter of the basketball game, and I'm sitting here next to the coach, not getting it,
Yeah.
part of what I'm realizing is I don't have much to talk about with him.
Yeah.
Like maybe three-quarters of my relationship with God was coworkers,
Hmm.
and I really enjoyed working with God. He
Hmm.
seemed to, over the years, put me into situations that where I really needed him, and so I was really glad to have him there. But um, but it was as coworkers, and so we were, you know, taking on these challenges together,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
And now there's, you know, much smaller challenges that I'm taking on with him.
Yeah.
It seems.
Yeah.
So that's one big thing, I guess. And the other thing is actually it brings me back to the whole question of discernment. Like all the things that I've loved helping others with, I'm having to do myself, of slowly piecing together, well, what in the world is God up to, and what does He want? And so, on the one hand, in our denomination or in our region, there's all sorts of forms of turmoil going on, and so ecclesiastically, it's a very turbulent time and a tough one to find my place in. On the other hand, um, helping people figure out what God's doing in apparent turbulence, um, when their church has died or looks like it needs to die.
Mm,
Um, you ask questions in those kind of times differently than you do when the rows are full and the offering plates are bringing what you need.
yeah,
And so I just, that seems pretty simple to me, that's what He has me here to do. I think
yeah,
there's a need for that. And I just don't know how or where. And
yeah, yeah,
I'm not going to worry about that till Easter.
yeah. Well, at the same time, I listen to you, and this may or may not be fair, but you don't. I mean, you don't seem terribly anxious, and I mean that in a good way. I think, yeah, I can very much understand a lot of panic on Deb's part when, first she's angry, you missed the flight, and then it's like, then she's no longer angry and she wishes you were just angry.
Yeah,
Now she's concerned, and she's driving, she's furiously driving down to Chicago with her sister-in-law because you've fogged out at the airport, and now you got to get yet a third stent put in. And but for a while, my mom was sending me, updates, and there was a time when both you and Deb were in the hospital at the same time.
right. That was a whole
Um,
different story.
yeah, when she had that bicycle accident.
Yeah,
Um, but it does seem though that I mean, you've landed on your feet. You're in a place. You're continuing to rehab this old house. Once again, as in seminary, it's a duplex, and so you've got a renter who's helping to to cover that end. So no, it just seems like there are, I don't know, who knows what new opportunities God might have in store for you in
yeah,
ways that you can't really anticipate, because you certainly didn't anticipate. It's funny because when you get to our age, you sort of look back over a life and realize, when you're young, you sort of have an idea about how things are supposed to go, and they haven't gone anywhere like probably the way you thought they were supposed to
yeah,
go. And so now that there's just sort of a shorter trajectory, but not necessarily a terribly short trajectory. I mean, we're not that old.
yeah,
Um, and we're regularly around. I mean, both of us, our mothers are still alive.
yeah,
So it's, who knows how God will use you or what He'll use you to do. I mean, I didn't, when I was making the Freddie and Paul show, I wasn't. This might take you by surprise, but despite Freddie's hope that the Freddie and Paul show would launch us into stardom to the likes of doing the halftime show at the Super Bowl, I was never really quite sure that was going to happen. And I wouldn't say that that has happened with the other things that have happened, but I don't know. I quite frankly don't know if I'd like to do the halftime show at the Super Bowl. I think that might be actually a fairly awkward thing for me and the audience. So, but who knows what God will do and what He will use and where He will take us and what He will
yeah.
accomplish through us. I mean, we really don't. So, yeah, I don't know.
I've come to learn a lot about myself by learning a lot more about God through this.
Yeah.
For instance, it it wouldn't surprise me. Like, first of all, trying to say three things at the same time. Um, the God is clearly at work, and there are so many ways. Deb and I often list them, just ways in which this whole situation is a really wonderful way for a really bad thing to happen,
Mm,
and um, like clearly not by accident. Somebody thought this through well in advance,
yeah,
and that's very very obvious to us,
yeah,
which makes it close to a no-brainer that that will continue into the future.
yeah,
Our future will be nothing like we thought it would have been. I
yeah,
thought it would have been by now.
yeah,
However, we will be very well taken care of in our future.
yeah,
The problem is not that I have a reasonable doubt whether I'll be taken care of or whether we'll be fine. The problem is that I've lost a lot of my sense of control.
mm,
And it's the sense of control, especially for a high D direction setter, gift of leadership type, a strategic thinker. If you A strategic thinker who can't look out the windshield and see where he's going is nothing,
yeah,
is what it feels like. And
yeah,
so the issue is much more between me and God rather than through me and my circumstances.
yeah,
And and that's what I think he's working on me really. And that's why the fasting from worrying about
yeah,
this during Lent is the most significant thing that I could feel I could do at this point,
yeah,
because um, the 25% of my connection to God, that was just me and God hanging out together.
yeah,
That's all I have. And that's what this season is all about, growing.
yeah.
And I'd love to have 50-50 someday.
All right. All right. Well, very good. Well, thank you, Ron. And I reconnected with Ron recently, and it was good. And I thought, hey, we get lots of different randos come in all shapes and sizes and all kinds of different stories. And I thought it'd be kind of fun to throw Ron's story into the mix. I invited him into the Friday thing, and are you going to start? I told he's like, well, what's going on? Because he's riffed and winkled for a few years, and I said, well, Substack's kind of a might be a good place for you to play in,
Yeah.
especially that you want to write and. But probably you'll have to do a lot of reading and a lot of listening. Things have moved fast in the last 5 years. There's things have I mean the pandemic, it's really weird. You wouldn't think that sort of stopping everything would accelerate everything, but I think in a lot of ways it did. It
Hmm.
certainly did that in the Christian Reformed Church. And maybe not in a very welcome way, but it's it's a different world than it was in 2020 in a lot of different ways. And so, yeah, there'll be a lot of, but it's also the case that every place is different. And, West Michigan is very different from Sacramento and different
Yeah.
from Chicagoland and. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see what comes.
Yeah. It will.
So, all right, very good. I'm going to land
Well,
the
thank
plane
you,
then.
Paul. I enjoyed this.
Oh, good. I
Yeah.
figured you would. I
Yeah.
figured you would. Well, it's just fun because actually, like I said, sort of once you got to Sacramento and beyond Sacramento, I was pretty much up to speed with things, but you just kind of live in life and you don't necessarily dig into some of the older story things
Yeah.
and uh and I thought too for many of the people in my channel have an unusual and perhaps unhealthy fascination with the Christian Reformed Church through me because partly because of the fight that it's had over the last 5 years,
Okay.
but I think partly because at certain levels, as has likely always been the case, the Christian Reformed Church is a microcosm for the much larger changes going through our society. And that certainly was true, for you at Southern Heights and, you know, the gathering, many of the different stages that have happened. So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, I'm gonna end the recording. So
All
thank you,
right.
Ron.
All
Thanks for
right. Thank
sharing
you,
your story.
Paul.